So today, this Sunday is Sunday in ordinary time, but it is the last Sunday before we enter the Lenten season, and the Lenten season will begin on Ash Wednesday, which is on a couple of days from now, which is 3 days, and it is very close that we will celebrate Lenten season. But going back to the gospel today, in the gospel we heard how Jesus begins his parable with a rhetorical questions to his disciples. And he started with the question, can a blind person guide a blind person? So when we hear this question spontaneously, I believe that the possible answer we can say is no, for sure. And we do not even need to think about it in order to answer that question, because that's really basic questions. Just like can someone doesn't know how to drive teach someone who wants to drive? So the answer for sure, no. Otherwise, they're going to go to the pit. Now, the problem here is Jesus asked his disciple with such a rhetorical question because he wants to make sure whether or not they understand what he taught them before and now. It has something to do with the gospel last Sunday. The question is, do you still remember the gospel last Sunday? So the gospel last Sunday is pretty tough also, because it was about the golden rule, right? The golden rule says, do not do to others as you would have them do to you. Forgive and you will forgiven. Give and the gifts will be given to you. So that's the golden rule. And the golden rule means that we should act toward others in the way we would like them to act toward us. But the question also why Jesus asking this disciple is because it has something to do with what he taught last Sunday. It has something to do with the golden rule. So Jesus contrasted himself here with the questions, can a blind person guide a blind person? He contrasted himself with the religious leaders. Now, there are a lot of religious leaders at the time. And normally in the gospel, especially the gospel of Matthew, for instance, Jesus would refer to the Pharisees and the scribes as blind guides and also false teachers. But surprisingly, today in the gospel, apparently Jesus made it wider in applications. So he taught them who the blind guides are, which means it is not only the Pharisees and the scribes that can be a blind guides or false teacher, but also it could be other group of people who are any individual who claim themselves as a teacher and have interests for themselves. So really wide here these applications. Can a blind person guide a blind person? So indirectly Jesus tells them, well, I'm telling to you the truth, but if you don't follow me, then you can follow the other teachers or false teachers who have interest from themselves. Now, okay, in order to make it understandable who the blind guides are or false teachers are, Jesus metaphorically speaks about the relationship between the teacher and the disciple. There is a connection here. He said, no disciple is superior to the teacher, but when fully trained, every disciple will be like his teacher. It makes sense here. So the reason why Jesus speaks in such way to his disciple, because his disciple who are listening his sermons look at him as a teacher who taught them with authority. So the key here is the authority. And we can wonder why many people at the time would like to listen to Jesus. That's because he spoke with authority. So, dear friends, as a true teacher, Jesus speaks the truth so that they will be like them. So therefore, by speaking metaphorically about the relationship between a teacher and disciples, Jesus is setting before his disciple the choice following him as a true teacher or following others. But the interesting part at this point is that Jesus did not force them to follow him. Even directly, he gave them a choice not to follow him with precaution about false teachers. Meaning to say, if you don't follow me, that's pretty fine. But remember, out there are many false teachers and blind guides who will give you a hard time. So, in other words, here Jesus wants his disciple that they must have a clear vision than the person they seek to lead. That is the goal toward which the disciples should strive, being fully trained. And Jesus here is really a true master that training his disciple to understand, if you don't follow me, then you must have a clear vision, at least like me, so that you can be a true disciple also. So now as we move forward, what Jesus said about the relationship between a teacher and disciple, this parable apparently is grounded strongly with the image of splinter and in the brother's eye and a wooden beam in one's own eye. We know this. Why do you notice the splinter in your brother's eye? And then you say, brother, let me remove the splinter in your eye. But Jesus said, remove this wooden beam from your eye first. Then you will see clearly to remove the splinter in your brother's eye. Well, the parable here apparently became really interesting when we see the connections. First, Jesus asking. Second, Jesus give a true example, relationship between a teacher and disciple. Then, Jesus brought them into themselves to understand. Okay, before you say something to others, rather, take a look at yourself first. That's why in a connection with the metaphor of fully trained disciple, as Jesus wanted to be, a fully trained disciple must bear wisdom because the disciple has gone through the learning process, discipleship process, and also mentorship. And eventually, someone or the disciple who has been fully trained will be like a teacher, like a Jesus. So this kind of disciple must be able to raise self-awareness and being wise to look at any kind of circumstances. So dear friends, therefore here the bottom line is that the image of splinter and wooden beam in connection to his disciple as a teacher, it gives us a lesson that the good disciple should not judge others' fault without first addressing his own fault. Otherwise, what we can hear through the gospel, he is a hypocrite. And there is a parable also, or it is very common in our society, when we point our finger to others, there are 4 or 3 that coming back to us. Right? That's precisely here that we hear. And then Jesus really wonderful when giving lessons. So at this point, Jesus is not ruling out a personal connection to others, but rather critical spirit in which the starting point of judging is oneself instead of others. Now, why Jesus tell them like that? It is because the problem with judging is that the one who sets himself or herself up as a judge of others' persons' imperfections, he or she is imperfect too. So it is like the blind leading the blind. And that's exactly what we hear with the connections, the first question that Jesus addresses. Now, the bottom line here, Jesus already gave them lessons. In order to understand what Jesus said to the gospel today, Jesus also indirectly gave them understanding about who they are. And we need to look at the Pharisees and the scribes who are always look out to accuse others. The scribes and the Pharisees personify many problems in the society, especially when it comes to the religious practices. They strive to keep the law and to ensure that others do so as well. Well, that's a good thing because the law is God's law and God prizes a faithfulness to the law. However, the problem with the Pharisees and the scribes is that they take it into another level of scrupulousness with assumptions that they are good and the rest of the world is bad. So in other words, the Pharisees and the scribes teach people the more scrupulous we are, the more prone we are to self-righteousness, to imagining that we are right and the rest of the world is wrong. That's terrible. So that is the case with the scribes and the Pharisees when Jesus warns his disciples that we must be careful lest we be guilty of adopting this kind of judgmental attitude. So dear friends, the question for our reflection today, this Sunday, is what can we learn from the gospel this Sunday? We have learned a lot from Jesus, at least how Jesus applied these questions. Can blind person leading another blind person? He gave us a lot of examples. But how should we apply what Jesus taught us? What Jesus said in the gospel today, actually, especially in the last part of the gospel, is a good conclusion, by the way, and pretty much enough to highlight our reflection this Sunday. A good tree does not bear a rotten fruit, nor does a rotten tree bear a good fruit, for every tree is known by its own fruit. So here, Jesus took the image of tree to illustrate the parallel principle of our spiritual lives. Jesus very grounded here because the reason at the time, many people, especially his disciples, had no access for the educations. So they are very simple people. Jesus took the image of tree to illustrate a parallel principle in our spiritual life. So just as a good tree bears good fruit and a bad tree bears bad fruit, so also a good person produces a good attitudes, and evil persons will produce evil attitudes. So our actions are our outward expression of our inward being. It is out of good treasure of the heart that the good person produces a good, and out of evil treasure of his heart that evil person produces evil. So the principle is that our words reflect accurately the condition of our spiritual heart, and the words make it clear when what is our heart. So this is precisely what Jesus meant in the gospel today. From the fullness of the heart, the mouth speaks. Meaning to say, sometimes we are challenged to be careful. When we can practice what Jesus said today, the bottom line of our reflection this Sunday is that we are challenged to be consistent, but at the same time also we are encouraged to be flexible when it comes to our spiritual practice.